I wasn't even part of it. You do it. And we'll cover the bus. How are you doing with that? Huh? Well, I said you already do it in the next. That'd be crazy if sound like. I mean, it sounds quick. Sure. Probably cool. Huh?
You're from the Monday presentation group. The Monday presentation group?
Yeah.
You are, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
You wanna watch my new last
Have you more questions to get together?
Yeah, we met on.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone got active there?
Everyone's not met at the same time, but we've had a couple of meetings.
Okay, but everyone's been involved?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So good. So we discussed the other one, the whole period, if any questions you come up with, discussing, feel free to let me know. Okay, there's a lot of good stuff in there. I think we can do very good presentations on this. And don't be afraid to talk, just not just about what what is this said about Rome.
Okay.
All right, let me know specifically. Come on.
Okay. And we're meeting Sunday night.
That sounds
I only do it if it's like really sugary. It's like, I put syrup and powder. That's what I'm just doing. Yeah. Pretty much. Extra chocolate. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he does.
Then don't do it first. I can't keep watching it anymore.
It's just about 11. Before we start out, I sent everyone an email. So next Friday, so a week from today, is the second quiz in the class. The only reason I sent a reminder, the format is exactly the same as the first quiz. The exact days that will be quizzed are on the syllabus, so it's really no surprises. I won't hold this in class because I'm holding a mini lecture after the quiz, right? So after the quiz happens. If, however, any of you find yourself, sick or isolated or quarantined, etc., please let me know in advance. Okay, then I'm happy to have you take it on Blackboard if there's a special circumstance. Of course, anything having to do with the corona, don't come to class. You just take it online. But just let me know if that applies to you. All right, does that make sense? But as I said, I will hold that one in class because, or else, then, I won't be able to give a mini lecture. So I basically hold you captive. I force you to come here to take the quiz, more or less. Make sense? That's not until next Friday. So if those of you who fall behind in the reading, you have plenty of time to make up. So don't worry about that, but do it. Today we continue our discussion of Rome, but you'll notice from the title that we're moving into a very different stage of Roman government. And in fact, the Roman Republic, which you knew for only a very short period, is after all of the chaos created, especially by Julius Caesar, but others, the Republic begins to fall down. And now, in this period today, we'll see the beginning of a new empire, a government now in which one person now is at the center, the emperor. And the size of the empire can tell also increases significantly. We know, in fact, that this new form of government is largely the brainchild of one man, a man who was born by the name Octavian, although we often refer to him by the name he was only given midway through his career, the term Augustus. And this is a term that means the honored one. This is a term that was given to him because of his accomplishments, which we'll talk about throughout the beginning of the lecture. So who is this guy? I didn't mention, yeah.
Was it common for someone of importance to receive a new name when they got
Absolutely.
a certain level of achievement?
When, especially for instance, battle heroes, war heroes, would very often they would get some honorific added to their name, depending upon where they had been victorious. So that idea is really perfectly common for Romans. And nowadays, historians will just refer to him by Augustus because it's easier, basically. But that trend is throughout Roman history. Yeah. Augustus is the reason why he was able to gain so much power so quickly is because although he had been an absolute nothing politically before Julius Caesar's death, it appears that Julius Caesar himself saw something of quality in the young man. And in part because there's a familial relation. Julius Caesar's great nephew. On top of that, and even more important really for his political future, is that Augustus was the adopted heir of Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar died, he actually adopts Augustus. And you may think, well, it's kind of weird to adopt someone who's an adult, which he was. But this is actually, again, something that for Romans is totally common. They will actually adopt people even very late in life. And so he actually is quite, for Romans, quite literally the son of Julius Caesar. And this is one of the first things that Augustus uses to trumpet how great he is. He actually begins to have these coins that refer to himself as son of a god. Because remember I told you last time that Julius Caesar had been made a Roman god. So in fact, he actually was quite literally the son of a god that people worshipped. And this is just the first of many things that you know about Augustus. and his very sort of clever political mind. Even the people who hated him had to admit, this guy was a very good politician. And part of that is that he splashes up images of himself all over the place. Aside from Alexander the Great, we have more statues and images of Augustus than nearly anybody from the ancient world. This is one of the ones that is the most famous statues that we have of Augustus. This Augustus, very interesting, and it's just kind of, I'm sorry, this is half up here, but as a man of sort of like vision. Also, although he himself, that place, although he himself was never a great general, he relied on others to do a lot of his fighting for him. In the Roman terms, you always have to show yourself as a general. So he has a breastplate on as well. The other thing, of course, you're curious about is, who is this naked baby? This is not just any naked baby, but this is Cupid. And in fact, his family, one of their descendants was the goddess Venus, and Cupid is also as part of that. So he's just reminding people of divine ancestry, in essence, not just showing off naked children. The Augustus really, he's only 18 years old upon Julius Caesar's death, but immediately he becomes a major political player because he has this connection to the dead dictator. And that he really trumpets that, he has all this propaganda to show that he will do the same thing Julius Caesar did. And in fact, many of those people who previously had been part of Julius Caesar's party, they begin now to turn over to Augustus. They say, okay, he's going to help us in the way that Julius Caesar would have if he had lived. So he gets a lot of connections, he gets a lot of money right at the beginning of his political career. The only reason why he's not, though, able to just seize control of the state entirely is because there's yet another man who had a strong connection to Julius Caesar. This is one of the other sort of great men in the state at the time, a man named Mark Antony. Here is a bust of Mark Antony. Now, Mark Antony was again someone, he had actually been a general and had fought quite courageously with Julius Caesar. And so he actually many people who loved Julius Caesar felt that Mark Antony would also be someone who would be good to follow in Julius Caesar's footsteps. The problem with Mark Antony, though, is he was always a little bit controversial because he was known to be a bit of a hard drinker and hard partier. With a little bit too much, probably to the detriment of his career. In the beginning, both Augustus and Mark Antony recognized that neither man could take over the state completely, and so they decided to do the next best thing. They decided to become friends. They actually began to consider, they issue these coins in which on one side you see Mark Antony, and on the other side you see Augustus, as a sign of this new friendship between the two of them. They actually, one of the ways that you make friends in the ancient world is you begin to marry one another's relatives. The two of them do that as well. So and they actually, they although there's not much the two of them really can agree on, there actually is one major project that they undertake together, which is to say they kill off all of their enemies. They create this long list of people who had any opposition to either man, and they just systematically begin to eliminate them. And that really is the high watermark of their cooperation. We do think, though, both of these men were really enormously ambitious, and neither one would really end up allowing the other one to survive. So there was going to be a war at some point, and everyone knew it. But in effect, Mark Antony also was foolish enough to not only get involved in a war, which everyone knew was going to happen, but he also was stupid enough to fall into Augustus's kind of propaganda trap against him. Mark Antony, again, was already known to be a bit of a partier, but he also decided that since there was no active war going on at the time, he decided to basically go to Egypt and crash there. And really, this was even before Egypt was a part of Rome, so it was in a foreign territory. while he was there, he decides to, and I guess the technical term is he shacks up with the last independent queen of Egypt. This is Cleopatra. Cleopatra, by the way, is a fascinating figure in her own right. I'm trying for her. She's really very quite intelligent, and it was the last vestige of this old Greek ruling house that was in Egypt after Alexander's conquest. The problem Cleopatra faced was that really she had many people in her own family wanted to knock her off the throne. And simultaneously, Rome looked like it was going to dominate everywhere in the Mediterranean. And so her best chance was to try to get as close as possible to Romans, to hope that they would allow her to survive. But unfortunately for her, she bet on the wrong horse. And she decided to start this sort of sexual relationship with Mark Antony in the hopes that Mark Antony will win the war, and he doesn't. Now, the reason why this is so important for the history of Rome is not just because it's scandalous, but because Augustus takes the situation and then he begins to say to Romans, look, who really cares about Rome and the Roman people? Mark Antony? Mark Antony is off in Egypt. You know, he's living the high life. He's sleeping with this Oriental whore. And I'm here doing things in Rome. And this kind of language, I mean, this was really very powerful. People's prejudices were woken up by this, and then they begin to turn against Mark Antony and say, listen, he's not a real Roman. He's spending all this time fooling around with Cleopatra. Eventually, Augustus will then raise up a large army and will fight against Mark Antony and ultimately militarily beat him soundly. The only situation, in fact, the only way out really Mark Antony sees is to simply commit suicide. Cleopatra does as well. She dies as an Egyptian queen ought to die. She had a poisonous Egyptian snake, an asp, smuggled into her jail cell, and she allowed it to bite her, which is pretty cool. I mean, I'm not advocating doing this, but I mean, you know. In any case, at this point, Augustus simply takes over the entire country of Egypt for himself, basically. And as you can tell, the urge to go native in Egypt is impossible to resist. He too begins to project himself as pharaoh. But why this is important for Rome now is that in his piggy bank is an entire country. So he's by far the richest man in Rome. He can afford to keep arms. At this point, the long civil war that started at the end of the Republic in Rome was over. And the last man standing was Augustus. And so you might think that he would go ahead and proclaim himself dictator for life, as Julius Caesar had done. But you know what? He had actually learned some lessons from Julius Caesar, which is that it's not a good idea to declare yourself dictator for life. And so Augustus was smart enough to not just proclaim himself dictator. Instead, he wanted to make his opponents, he forced them to show how powerful he was. And so he actually goes in front of the Senate and says, I'm going to lay down all of the extraordinary powers that were given to me during the Civil War. I don't want any of it. I'm going to go back and live my life as a private citizen. You know, goodbye. This really was a clever move on his part, because everyone in Rome knew that without Augustus there, everything would all of a sudden become another civil war. So the only person who kept keeping things in order was Augustus. And so all of a sudden, the Roman governing bodies begin to vote Augustus many powers, even more than he had actually asked for originally, because they knew that they had to have him there now. The state wasn't secure without his protection. Again, even just to show you how smart Augustus is, the term that we use today in English, emperor, is from a Latin term, imperator, which really simply was used generally they gave it to people, someone who was a successful general. They would proclaim him an imperator, someone who's a commander, basically, by our terms. But it was not a term that really had a political significance. And he starts to use it now for himself, because it's a term that, again, unlike dictator, does not have an immediately negative connotation to it. So it was a nice term to use, really, because people didn't think of it necessarily as being a political office at all, really. Augustus, first of all, in getting all this new power, he begins to give out land to all of his veterans to make sure that he has military support for good, more or less. And he begins to now accept all of these positions that previously would never have gone to one person back when the Republic was still operating. He, for instance, gets voted consul again and again and again. He sometimes will take more than one office at once. He actually begins to take all the power of a tribune as well, including he's sacrosanct. You're not allowed to physically touch him or else you will be assassinated, you'll be killed, executed by the state. He also, later on, and I'll talk more about this, he becomes the chief priest in the state. Why not? And all of these things meant that now all of a sudden one man had more power than any one person had ever had. No one repeals the Republic. The Republic doesn't really theoretically ever stop, but it loses all its authority. Because now, no one's looking to the Senate for advice. No one's really trusting the politicians. And in fact, politicians now look to Augustus to say, what should we do next? What vote should we have? So even though elections continue to go on, everybody knows now where the power really resides. And even if you were unhappy about all of this, there's scarce little you could do about it because he also had his own private army that surrounded him, which one man never had before in Rome. Despite now, again, being the master of Rome, really being in some ways a master of war, Augustus was at pains to present himself publicly as a man of peace who had brought peace to Rome. And one of his most famous monuments, he's lots of monuments, but just one I'll tell you, this is known as the Altar of Peace that he erects after his great victory. And the Altar of Peace, this is primarily a pagan altar, so it's meant to sacrifice animals or slit the throat of animals on this altar. However, you'll see on both sides, you're able to put up all sorts of propaganda messages, which, for instance, basically position all of the important people in the state, all ordered as Augustus wanted them to be. This is usually seen as a mythological representation of Rome. Look how much fertility there is. Nature itself is growing as a result of all of Augustus's great things, great deeds. And there are all sorts of mythological scenes that tie together Augustus with the foundation of Rome, as if to suggest that he is refounding the city, more or less in his image now. Augustus's hold on power is so secure that even after Augustus himself finally dies, 5 men who are in his family, not necessarily biologically related, but adopted in some cases, they come after him. So the same family continues to dominate this new position emperor that he created. But we think that, in fact, adoption actually becomes now the standard way to signal who you want your successor to be. You adopt them before your death, and then that person is supposed to take over after you die. It's fair to say that not all of these emperors in the future are ever going to play the game quite as well as Augustus did. He was just really a very talented person at doing this. And in fact, some of the later emperors are going to be far more oppressive than he is, which in turn is going to lead to people in some cases, to threaten their lives and sometimes to outright assassinate them. Because there's no other way to get rid of an emperor. Unlike other politicians in the past, you can't vote them out. If they're alive, they're in power. So then you just have to kill them. And you can understand why they're enemies that the emperor is always going to have. The Senate, for instance, hates the fact that it used to have all the power, and now it doesn't. So some of these high-placed men in the state always are going to hate the emperor. And that means that there's constant manipulation and intrigue when it comes to deciding who the next emperor will be. Everyone wants this power. Oh, yeah, please.
How do they allow emperors if they didn't like dictators? Like, how is it different, or how do they not see it as like similar, or like, do they just like him so much that they didn't care that he had all the power, or like?
Personality does play, it plays a big role, first of all. He has a personality. He's very good at sort of doing this kind of thing. But in essence, he had managed to so cleverly hollow out all the institutions to the public that even by the end of his reign, most people think that there's no going back to the republic.
So was it just like built up and then they realized it's too late and you have like all the
Well, we know that there's some conservatives who, at least in theory, want to go back to the republic. But again, right after the wars are over, there's too much fear that this is going to lead to chaos. And then by the time even Augustus is dead, it was too far gone for them to go back. But you're absolutely right in saying that. I mean, for us, looking back, it looks exactly like they had created either a dictator or a king. But they would never have used those terms.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we think, though, especially as later emperors were never quite as talented as Augustus, increasingly the real power of the Roman state was going to be rooted in the military. And in fact, when Augustus's family finally gets out of office because of mismanagement of later emperors, ultimately the people who grasp control of the imperial position are generals. And so, in fact, they have more power than anything else. So there'll be a civil war at Augustus' death, which will lead then eventually to military men taking over. And very often now, military support becomes absolutely essential to anyone becoming emperor. So first of all, we have a new form of government. Second of all, we also have an expanding Rome during this period. And you'll see just by looking at this map that first of all, Rome as a government expands to its hugest height, and it will in time basically wrap around the Mediterranean Sea like a blanket. Essentially, is what Rome does. And in fact, it actually begins to find its largest extent. Even conquering what today is modern-day England becomes part of the empire, so outside the Mediterranean. In the east, where they're finally checked by the Persians. In the north, where they never really managed to take over modern-day Germany. And the Romans very cleverly begin to deploy their soldiers at really the hot points. The soldiers tend to congregate either on the northern border of Germany and the eastern border with the Persians. These are the places where they fear invasion most. Most places there's not a huge military presence because there doesn't have to be. These places view peace. And in fact, again, peace was one of the things that both Augustus and later emperors always talk about. And in fact, sometimes people refer to this entire period as this kind of Roman peace. It was a peace that was certainly brought by violence, and the threat of violence constantly hung over people. But there was peace. And in fact, what it meant was that it allowed things like, for instance, social life and economic life to flourish as long as you didn't go against Rome. The Romans in the north of England, by the way, they end up putting this wall just to mark that they're not going to go any further. And that was one of their northernmost border. In many cases, and I told you in last class that subject peoples in the Roman Empire were not forced to act like Romans, to become Romanized. But we do think that there's a lot that was very attractive about Roman culture, and especially elite natives in many places throughout these areas that they had conquered. They will take over Roman language. They will, for instance, they will begin to read the same works and the same culture that Romans respected. And this doesn't mean, of course, that they were forced necessarily at home to speak Latin or to do anything Romans did, but it did mean that to be able to interact in this empire, it made a lot of sense to respect the Romans and to imitate them in many ways. We also think that Romans, of course, just by in some ways having this huge military, allowed all people to begin to travel and communicate far better than they had before. And we really do think that Romans think a great deal about how to administer an emperor of this size. And to some degree, they even solve problems that previous empires, like the Persians, had never done so well. Centralizing records, for instance, in the city of Rome. Using the army very often for domestic purposes. You never want to allow the army just to sit still, right? So whenever you need a wall built, whenever you need to fix a bridge or something like that, you can actually just send the army out to do that. So they were constantly working, doing something. If nothing else, too, we tend to think that in part the genius of Rome, the genius of their governance of this territory is that it was so stripped down and minimal. Governors continue to really have to do very little other than keep order and keep money flowing to the center. That's about it. And in fact, many people even think that governors become slightly better under the empire because now the emperors actually are hand-picking many of the people who go out and serve as governors, and they're responsible to the emperor. So people who are truly incompetent or too corrupt for their own good just get removed entirely under normal circumstances. We think that in addition to just wanting to be like Romans, many subject people who lived in this wide territory that Romans controlled, there was always stick if they chose to revolt, which is to say that there'd be violence against them. But Rome was smart enough also to dangle out the carrot of granting people full Roman citizenship if they agreed with Rome or helped Rome in some tangible way. That in fact, they would give out the privilege of making someone a full citizen, which would give you special rights, like, for instance, certain rights having to do with justice. People who were full Roman citizens, for instance, could appeal to the Roman emperor if they got a judgment against them at the local level they didn't like. So that was a right that not everyone had, unless you were a full citizen. Altogether, we begin to see this remarkable assimilation of cultures in the Roman world. So much so that, in fact, many of our artifacts, many of this sort of physical signs of Rome look similar throughout the entire empire. You can get along in the Roman world just knowing 2 languages, essentially, is all you really needed. 2 languages were, of course, Latin and Greek. And those people who were at the top of the social ladder would learn both languages. And so that roughly the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the areas that Alexander the Great had conquered, all continued to speak Greek on a daily basis. And the western parts all spoke Latin. And as I said, in some cases they'll put up inscriptions like this that'll have both languages and show enough people know enough to make it worthwhile to write this for other people. And, we do know that educated Romans will be schooled, again, people especially who have money. And for an ancient society, Rome has a very high literacy rate, which is around 15% of the population could read and write, which you may think it seems teeny in comparison to our own civilization, but in comparison to other ancient civilizations, that's a lot of people who can read and write. And we can see that, in fact, that there are all sorts of inscriptions, there have been all sorts of graffiti all over the place in Rome, which, there are enough people who could read to make these things worth putting up in the first place. Now, I mentioned to you earlier that by and large, Romans, in terms of their culture, take a lot from Greek culture. That's absolutely true. But at least in 2 areas, 2 really practical fields, Romans are innovators. The first of these is law. Romans were known to really have this great attraction to the law. And what's actually interesting is that some of the great minds in the Roman world, they go into being lawyers, they go into writing commentary on the law. this is seen to be a very high profession. I care a lot about law. The other big field in which Romans are known to be innovators is engineering. Engineering is a profession for some of the most important people. And signs of that engineering prowess were all over the place. Roman roads, which were built so well that even for centuries after Rome no longer existed, people would still walk on Roman roads. Roman bridges, even more perhaps important than bridges, aqueducts. What an aqueduct is, its basic goal, a Roman aqueduct, is to get fresh water into a city. These really are very cleverly created, that they take water from a fresh water source, and they take advantage basically of the contours of the land and gravity to have water flow down into cities. They don't have water pumps or anything, so it really is just a matter of constructing them to allow gravity to do the job of getting water into cities. And in fact, some of these aqueducts were so well made, there are actually some that actually still operate in Western Europe to this day, so that gives you some idea of what they could do. Another outlet of engineering is urban planning. Romans really, in some ways, create the idea of urban planning. And really, in some ways, they have this very sort of strict pattern that's repeated time and again of things that you need in your city. You need, for instance, to have a grid plan, which they almost all did. You needed to set up temples to certain gods, theaters to put on performances, baths, and you needed to set up monuments to flatter whatever emperor was in power at the time. And this ability to make cities was so advanced that some Roman cities swelled to enormous size. In the city of Rome itself, there are probably around 1 million people in the ancient world, which is enormous altogether. Now, as we talk about, of course, the many accomplishments of Rome, there really are some dark sides to Roman behavior. And again, some people who studied this in the past have always remarked about the fact that there's quite a bit of brutality that goes along with Roman civilization. And one of the most famous examples, of course, is gladiatorial games, which in the Roman world were widely popular. This is, of course, the Colosseum in Rome, where this would take place, but there were Colosseum all over the place in Rome. And where basically you would watch two people, in some cases, killing one another. Not always killing, but this guy did not make it out alive. These are usually people who are slaves, who are gladiators. So the few people who did not go to gladiatorial games were, of course, robbers. Because this was a great time to break into people's houses because everyone was at the game. So, but people used to they liked watching. There were different styles of what kind of gladiators you could be. So some people really liked the guys, for instance, that have the fishnets and spears. Other people like the heavily armored ones. So you could kind of choose what gladiators you wanted to root for. And some of them became quite popular if they survived. We also, as I mentioned to you earlier too, Rome had been a slave civilization. And in fact, any job that was unpopular or people didn't want to work on tended to be done by forced labor, by people who were owned. That especially means plantations in Rome were staffed almost all by slaves. Mining was a job that was generally done by slaves. And in fact, the number of slaves was enormous in Rome. The very rare slave could earn enough money to free himself or herself, but that's not most people. Most people lived and died as slaves. Toward the end of the conditions under which slaves were kept were so miserable that we know at the last years of the Republic there actually was a huge slave revolt in Rome that took a huge number of soldiers to finally put down. And when Romans finally put this down, they decided to send a statement to slaves in the future. I've angered something or someone.
I think it was the Gulf Herd. That was a motorcycle.
Oh, it's just a motorcycle. I feel good again. After Romans squashed this revolt, they would take supposedly 6,000 slaves who had survived, who had revolted, and then they would start at the city of Rome and then all the way down to the heel of Italy, and they ended up crucifying 6,000 slaves. And then they left their bodies to just hang out there and rot. So every slave in the future would get the message that you shouldn't do this. In case you want to know what this gory thing is, this is the bone of someone who's been crucified. You can see a nail still poking through it. Please.
Why would they do that to 6,000 slaves if those slaves had like unpopular jobs that got done?
Oh, but because they didn't trust them anymore. I mean, would you trust a slave who had cutlery and stuff?
But like these were the slaves that didn't revolt, right?
No. These are people who they caught after the battle, who just get took alive.
Oh, so they took the.
They killed some people on the battlefield. Others they waited afterwards to execute.
But they only killed the people that revolted.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. Yeah. We also think that there were some people who were never very happy to be part of the Roman Empire. Some subjects who did not assimilate. We know there was a major revolt in England. Perhaps even worse, the worst kind of revolt that Rome faced during this period is in what today's modern-day Israel. And again, we had spoken about earlier that the Jewish people did not necessarily want to be under Roman domination. In particular, we think because Romans were completely insensitive to any kind of Jewish demands ritually or religiously. For instance, Romans put up images of the emperor, which are not allowed to do religiously in Judaism in the city of Jerusalem. And this led to two huge revolts of the Jewish population, which were put down absolutely brutally by Romans. Here, for instance, are Romans carrying some of the objects from the temple that they had taken after they destroyed the second temple. In addition to all these other things, Romans had taxes. We don't think taxes were ever very heavy by ancient standards, but I don't need to tell you, of course, that no one wants to pay taxes, so this was a constant irritant for many subjects of how much money. Perhaps even worse than that is that Roman military was known to be very often heavy-handed with people who lived in areas of Roman control. In essence, when a Roman soldier came, they could take anything they wanted from subject peoples if they said it had a military purpose. And what that meant in practical terms is that as a native, if all of a sudden Romans asked you for something you owned, you'd have to just hand it over, or else you'd die. So there's not much negotiation that went on there. Finally, I did tell you earlier that it is fair to say that Romans, they really do have a very lively economic life. There's a lot of, for instance, shipping across the Mediterranean, and in some ways then the volume of economic life does really increase in the territories that Romans own. But we're often very surprised that, especially in the basis, the most basic sort of level of the economy, when it comes to agriculture, Romans in some ways really have a very primitive sort of methods of agriculture that were no improvement over any previous civilization. And we really think that in some seasons where you get a bad harvest, people just end up starving. That's just a normal way of life. And it's actually very interesting that, we think about these big cities that Rome had. These cities could never have been operable were it not for the fact that the emperor gives out free grain to the poor on a regular basis. That's the only way that they can actually live, because or else cities are unsustainable at this time. All right. The last thing I want to deal with is, again, a subject of some importance for Rome I haven't dealt with earlier. This is the issue of religion. And in fact, just like in any other ancient culture, religion was an absolutely essential part of Roman life. But it's very important to say that religion in Rome was not what you think religion is or should be. For instance, you may say that if I were to ask you about religion, it's about belief. Romans did not think religion was primarily a matter of belief. There was nothing like a creed in Roman, like these are the things I believe in. It really, to some degree, that was irrelevant. The other thing you might say about religion, among other things, might be that religion deals with morality, how you should act. Romans also didn't think that religion had anything to do with morality. If you wanted to do morality, you could join a philosophical school. You wouldn't do religion, really. What Romans think basically, what religion is a series of rituals that have to be fulfilled to placate the gods. That's essentially what the main function of religion is. And as such, this is a public matter. This is not something that's private. But in fact, if you do not carry out the appropriate rituals, the gods will absolutely destroy Rome. So it's important to make sure the gods get their due. And as I think I mentioned very quickly earlier, the main action that the state required, that you had to do religiously, was to do sacrifice of animals to gods. Now, again, this is so strange for us, but because this is true, this public function that religion has, you can't just allow religion, to be done by individuals because the rituals might not get done. So instead, they actually elect priests. A priest is an elected office like any other. And priests are attached to specific temples, and they do sacrifice to those specific gods. Including, as I mentioned to you earlier, this is Augustus here as the chief priest of the state. He's about to do sacrifice, and you cover your head when you're just about to do that. But that's just the number one priest. There are all sorts of other priests who have to do their sacrifice as well. As long as you didn't get in the way of doing these sacrifices, there was actually a great tolerance for different religion within the Roman state. In fact, there's a lot of variety in the kinds of things people worship. So, for instance, some gods that are worshipped are just kind of small-time agricultural gods that have long been worshipped by people in Rome. That's fine. Some gods that are worshipped are kind of like the big-name gods, the big-ticket gods. Think about, for instance, this is Neptune, god of the sea. This was still in Rome, which of course did a lot of movement on the sea and everything, he remained a very popular god. And so he had his own priest dedicated to him. And other gods that we've talked about before, sometimes gods that have counterparts in the Greek world will also just be absorbed into Roman religion as well. And that's fine. Some gods come from Egypt. We actually see some Egyptian gods, like Isis, will come into Rome as well, and that's fine as well. Religion was also on the individual household level. People have their own household gods and little shrines dedicated to them, and that you actually people did modest sacrifices to them to make sure your own gods were good to you, more or less. As I mentioned to you earlier too, some people turn to philosophy, philosophical schools, or some people turn to magic, and that was acceptable as well. Finally, as the empire goes on, people also begin to worship the emperor himself as a god. Again, this should bring in your head back to when we talked about Hellenistic Greece, but now it comes to Roman time. So, for instance, this is a cameo after Augustus' death, in which Augustus now is also being worshipped as a god. And later emperors will just be worshipped in their own lifetimes. Augustus didn't like this idea, but it just becomes common in time. With all of that, I will turn to a subject you probably know a lot about already, and that is the foundation of Christianity in the Roman world, the Roman Empire. Which starts off as really, in some ways, a very small story, which ends up in time becoming one of the great legacies of the empire. Part of the story of the foundation of Christianity goes back to what I mentioned to you earlier, this sort of situation that Romans faced in what today is modern-day Israel. Romans really felt that the Jewish population was not trustworthy, and it was basically a tinderbox waiting to go up in flames at any moment. And in fact, they were right. I mean, in effect, that the population hated them. And they were really, they did, of course, end up revolting twice. So this is part of the reason, again, if you think back to your Gospels, why would Romans want to have to put Jesus to death? It's not because they cared the least about his religious ideals. This was just a question of anyone who looked like a potential rebellious leader against Rome, or their attitude was to sort of shoot first and ask questions later. So they were perfectly willing to put innocent people to death and execute them so long as they kept control over the region. So that's part of the reason of the willingness of Romans to do so. Of course, very important in the story, this is actually a very famous archaeological find from Jerusalem. You'll see here, if you notice, look closely, these are part of the name of Pontius Pilate. Again, so the Roman governor at the time of Jesus, whose name you probably know. Altogether, that meant, of course, that Romans were always kind of, as I said, using sort of very heavy-handed with anyone they viewed as revolutionary leaders. Now, I don't need to tell you, of course, that Christianity continues, though, even after Jesus' execution. And in fact, although it appeared very unlikely at the beginning of Christianity, Christianity actually had several factors in the Roman Empire that help it to expand and allow it to survive and become even a larger religion. The first of these is this general yearning within the Roman world for new religious expressions that went beyond the state cult. So, for instance, I told you that from what I described to you, Roman religion was in some ways a very sterile and ritualized kind of practice. And that's not just my words. Many Romans actually begin to feel the same thing, and they start to look for religious traditions that are a little bit more emotionally involved. And we know concurrent with the foundation of Christianity, there are other religious traditions that are sometimes known as mystery religions that were circulating in the Roman Empire, which is one of the places where they would do worship. These mystery religions tended to come from the eastern part of the empire, as did Christianity. They were religions that very often had some emotional component, especially in their ritual. It wasn't just this sacrifice and that was it. We think that in many mystery religions there was an idea of very close companionship with other people who were believers, who would get together for meetings, for meals. There was a belief in life after death in some of these mystery religions, all of which really was lacking in the Roman state cult. We also think that Christianity benefits from its missionaries, and this is just Paul, but there was a lot of other examples of other early Christian missionaries. And in some ways, these missionaries were able to take advantage of the peace that Rome had created, through violence, but there was peace nonetheless. They were able then to use the roads that Rome had constructed, mainly for military and economic purposes, but the same people who were missionaries could use them. They were able to hop on some of the same ships that were being used for the economic life to make sure that everyone had the goods they wanted. And these missionaries were able to use the common language of early Christianity. Not Latin, but Greek. Greek was the main language of early Christianity. And because of Alexander's conquest, all sorts of people spoke Greek. So they were able to take advantage of that as well. At first, we think Christianity had very little recognition from Roman authorities. We don't tend to think that Romans at first recognized there was in fact any difference between Christians and Jews. And in fact, probably early Christians were persecuted more by other Jewish groups rather than Romans at first. But in time, especially after the destruction of the Second Temple, Christians begin to get more easily identified as being their own individual group. We really think at this point then, in some cases, Romans will begin to brand Christians as traitors on a religious sphere. And the reason for this, again, may be an unusual charge, but Christians, of course, in good conscience, could not actually sacrifice to the Roman gods They could not sacrifice to the Roman emperor or do any of the other rituals that were required to placate the gods. And this led some Romans to charge them that you don't care about the fate of the empire. If you did, you would do these actions. The decision of Christians to do this meant that in many cases, of course, Christians will choose to be martyred, to choose to be executed. And we begin to see these sporadic persecutions of Christians beginning to grow up by governors in the Roman world. Now, I can't go into most of these examples, but just to give you one example, this is a later picture of Lawrence, who's a deacon in the city of Rome. Supposedly, Lawrence is brought up before the governor in this region, and he's asked to sacrifice. He flat out refuses. He also doesn't turn any of the money of the church over, and so they decide to kill him. And as the story goes, Lawrence then is thrown down on a grill, where he proceeds to get grilled, and supposedly, midway through this process, he says, I think I'm finished on this side. You can turn me over now. That's very rare I even get a laugh out of that. So I give you all credit for that. All right, folks. I will see you next week on Monday. Thank you.
No, I'm gonna.